Now we're up to Daf Yudalit Omen Beis. Reish Lakish Omar on the bottom of Yudalit Omen Aleph Eno Soser. Naziris Tidei Lechud Udibrei Lechud. According to Reish Lakish, he began his Naziris Tidei Shalo, and now that Naziris is frozen, suspended in midair. He now, on the day that his wife gives birth to a ben, begins his Naziris L'Bno, and at that point, he has embarked on a brand new Naziris. There's no overlap over here. There's no continuation. There's no extension. He now will finish his 30 days of Naziris Al-Bino, and then he'll be mashlim the Nazir Shalatzmo. If he sees Tumah, according to Reish Lakish, during the Nazir Shal-Bino, then that has no impact whatsoever. If he has a Tumas Oseres during Nazir Shal-Bino, it doesn't impact on Nazirus Shalo, because that Nazir Shalo, as we said, is suspended in midair. And whatever he fulfilled, he crosses off those days that he was Mekayim Nazirus of Shalo, that's in a bank, locked up in the bank account, and when he gets back to it, he'll fulfill it. So the Gemara now goes on to bring on the top of Daf Yudalit Omen Beis an additional machlokas between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish about a Nazir who became a Mitzorah in the middle of his Nazirus. And the din is, again, we'll have to talk about Mitzorah Muchlat or Muzgar, but in any event, we're talking now about Mitzorah Muchlat. We'll explain that. And the din is that during those days that he's a Mitzorah Muchlat, those days do not count during his minyan of Yomei Nazirus. So once again, we have another scenario in which his Nazirus is frozen, so to speak, midway, because he's now a Mitzorah, and the Yomei Mitzorah not Olul in Nazirus. So he's going to have to pick up his Yomei Nazirus at the termination of and the purification from his Tumas Tzoras. So Nitma B'Yomei Tzorato, once again, Rabbi Yochanan Amar Soser, Reish Lakish Soser, Rabbi Yochanan Amar Soser, Daha ben Nazirus Kai. He's still in the middle of his Nazirus. Okay, he has to take a break from the counting of the Malos, and the days of his Tzaras are not all a minyan, but nevertheless, his Nazirus will be completed later on, and therefore the Tumah is Soser his entire Nazirus. And we see this period of Tzaras as a continuation of his Nazirus. Again, it's not Ola Leminion, but it is still Yemei Naziruso, such that his Tumah will be Soser. Reish Lakish Omer Eino Soser. Reish Lakish pins everything on whether it's Ola Leminion or not. Since the Yemei Tzarato are not Ola Leminion, therefore his Nazirus is mamish on the back burners, it's totally suspended, and his Tumah is not Soser. Tzaras L'chud v'Nazirus L'chud. Okay, here we have to give a little bit of a background based on a Mishnah later on Daf Nun Dalet Omen Beis, which is towards the end of Masechet, about the days of Tzaras that are divided into two different categories. Category number one is called Yemei Hes Gero. Okay, so the Kohen saw his nega, and after the Kohen saw the nega, he's Mazgir Shivas Yomim. He's quarantines the potential Mitzorah, which is called Hesger, for a period of 7 days. Then at the end of the 7 days, the Kohen comes back to check out the nega and see in Posa nega if it spreads. Those days of Yemei Gero, the Mishnah says, are Olim Leminyan Niziruso. But the Gemara later on Daf Nun Vav, quotes a brisa that those dinim of that, let's say, leniency that permits the Nazir to count these days as part of his Nazirus, even though he's a Mitzorah, that only applies to Hesger, because he's not a full-fledged Mitzorah. The Kohen has not yet declared him as such, because, again, the Kohen plays what's called a declarative role. He generates the Nazirus. The Tzaras. Now we get to Yimei Chaluto. So it means the days of Hezger have completed themselves. A week went by, and the Kohen checks out and he sees what's called Simone Tumah. And here there's a very unique halacha. It's what we call in Yiddish nishtaher and nishtahid. And what do I mean? That on the one hand, those days of Tumas Saras are not soser Yemei Nazirus. Normally Tumah is soser, but that's only Tumas Mes. Now we're talking about Tumas Saras. But even though there's no stira, and all the days that he observed Nazirus until the point that he was declared as a Mitzorah Muchlat, all those days are count and fulfill and will not be removed as far as his Nazirus is concerned. But nevertheless, as long as he's Tameh B'Tumas Saras, those days are not Olim Lo Laminyan Nazirus. That's why I call it Nishtahir Nishtahir. It's not a Tumah HaSoseres, but on the other hand, so the days that he counted are valid. But on the other hand, the days of his Saras are not Olim Laminyan Nazirus. Now, after he completes his Saras period of time, then it's very interesting. This is a law of Taras, not to be equated with the Giluach of a Nazir, but it happens to be, so to speak, that a Mitzorah also is Megalech Kol Sa'aro, before his Tefillah, to be Mitayr himself from Taras. And at that point, he's what's called a Mechusa Kapara. He has completed, let's say, 2/3 or 90% of his Tara. He's allowed to come back into the Machna, but he's also with Tashmish Hamita. And then on day 7, he's Megalech all of his Seir a second time around. Anyway, getting back to the Braisa on Daf Nun Vav, all these days of Tumas Saras are not Olo Lamini Yemei Naziruso. And from the moment that he became and was declared by the Kohen as a Mitzorah Muchlat, he interrupts his minyan of Nazirus. After his Tara is complete and he's no longer Tomei B'Tumas Saras, he picks up where he left off of the minyan of Nazirus. And in such a case, we have machlokas between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, an event that during his period of Nazir Mitzorah, again, it's not a minyan, but he's called a Nazir, and he sees and he contracts Tumas Mes. What's going to be the deal as far as Stira is concerned? Rabbi Yochanan is Machmir, and he sees those days as days of Nazirus, and therefore he's soser his Nazirus. He's got to start after his Tara from the beginning. Reish Lakish says, Eino soser, and that's the language of Tzaras L'chud v'Nazirus L'chud, since these days are not all minyan, therefore they're not considered a kiyum of his Nazirus. Since he's not involved in an active kiyum of his Nazirus, therefore it's not like the kedusha of a Nazir, such that Tumas Mes would now be soser as Nazirus. Everything is on deep freeze. Now he quotes a very interesting question here from Rabbeinu Peretz, one of the Baalei HaTosfos. Madua nechlaku Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish dafka ben Nazir shenitztara. This machlokes between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish does not have to be pinned or presented, framed in the case of Nazir shenitztara. He became a tzaras, a mitzorah. The machlokes should apply even to a Nazir shenitma bitumos she'ena Nazir megaleach aleim. In other words, why does the Gemara restrict and focus on Nazir shenitztareah? Any Nazir that became Tameh in a Tumah which is categorized as a Tumah she'en ha-Nazir megaleach aleim, which I'm going to assume now is going to be a reference to Tumah Sheretz, for example. Shedino, what's the din if he contracts Tumah during his Yemei Nazirus, but it's not a Tumas Mes? Is Eino Soser, but yet it's not Olo Minyan. That same din that we saw in Mitzorah after he's Muchlat, applies to any tumah, except, of course, tumas mes. So according to Rabbi Yochanan, if he contracted tumah during these days of his tumah, let's say tumah sheretz, is then, just 1 second. I think there's a printing mistake here. It should say she'ena Nazir megalech alehem, I think. So then, according to Rabbi Yochanan, Yistar Nazirusa. Why? Because even though he's not counting these days, there's still days of Nazirus. But according to Reish Lakish, since he's not counting these days, they're not all a minyan, then he's not a Nazir right now, so to speak, and the tomb is not so soon. Now, the Achronim here, especially the Brisker Rav, want to suggest that the answer to Rabbeinu Peretz's kasha lies in the Rambam. The Rambam in Perek Zayin Hilchos Nazirus says that Nazir shenitztareya eino kadosh b'yimei tzaraso. It's a very interesting language in the Rambam, that during his period of tzaras, he's not kadosh b'kedushas Nazir. In other words, the Rambam understands that kedushas Nazir and tumas tzaras are mutually exclusive. Says the Brisker Rav Yesh Lomar, Shekol Tamo Reish Lakish. Why does Reish Lakish say that if during Yemei Tzarato he became Tomei, is Eno Soser? That's because during those days, Paka Mimenu Kedushas Nazirus. According to the Rambam, Tumas Tzaras and Kedushas Nazirus are mutually exclusive. So if he doesn't have Kedushas Nazirus, then he can't be Soser. That's Reish Lakish. Let's say sheretz. Even Reish Lakish will be molded that's also Nazirus. Beautiful chiddush of the Brisker Rav. To justify and answer Rabbeinu Peretz's question, why the Gemara focuses and frames this machlokas dafka in the case of Tumas Tzaras. The Gemara says utzricha. We need both machlokosim between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, even in the case of Nitma b'Nazirus b'no, and even in the case of Nitma b'Yemei Tzarato. Di'itmar b'ach kamais. If we only had the machlokes in the first case of Tuma b'Yemei Nazirus b'no, that's when Rabbi Yochanan has this arichta business. By Rabbi Yochanan says soser. Why is he soser? Because Shem Nazirus Achasi. All these days are integrated into one qualitatively identical Nazirus. And therefore it's Nazirus Achas Arucha, in which if he was Nitma Be'emtza, in the middle of this Nazirus, it's Soser his entire Nazirus. But in the case where he became Tomei during his Yemei Tzaras, Ema, I might think Modalei Reish Lakish, which makes beautiful sense according to the Brisker Rav and the Rambam, because at that point we said that Tzaras and Kedushas Nazirus are mutually exclusive, so he doesn't have Kedushas Nazirus, and therefore Rabbi Yochanan would have to concede to Reish Lakish that he's not Soser, because you can only be Soser when you have Kedushas Nazirus. Be it my baha, but if we had the machlokis only in the case where he became Tomei during his days of Tzaras, he said Tzaras muchlat. His baha kam Reish Lakish. That's where Reish Lakish says that he's not soser because his kedushas nazirus is completely gone. Aval baha, in the case of Nitma b'Yemei b'no, ema modlei Reish Lakish. Rabbi Yochanan, maybe Reish Lakish would mod to Rabbi Yochanan that it's one long nazirus. Tzricha. Therefore, I need both machlokas. Now we have an additional machlokas between Rav and Shmuel with regard to another situation, another scenario of Tumah, whether it's soteris or not. So a person accepts upon himself Nazirus of Shloshim Yom, and then somebody cuts off his hair in the middle of his Yimei Nazirus. Well, what is that called? the Indians used to have that, what's it called, the tomahawk? I don't know what it's called. So anyway, somebody grabbed this guy and kidnapped him. A very bad person kidnapped him and shaved off his head, all his hair. Now, the law of Giluach is that Giluach requires Gidul Seir of 30 days. And here, in the middle of his 30 days, there was Giluach Seir. So he doesn't have what's called Seir HaRoy L'Tiglachas. The mitzvah Tiglachas requires a Gidul Seir of 30 days. So now what he has to do is, he's going to have to start counting 30 full days of Nazirus all over again. He gives a case here in the footnote, Kigon sha'adam kibel Nazirus shloshim yom, u'monamehem esrim yom, achkak gilchu list him. All right, so he only has 20 days of Gidul Seir. Kevin Chain Tiglachto b'mei Naziruso. Since he now has not fulfilled the mitzvah of Tiglachas, is therefore Soseres es minyon. Just 1 second. Oh, what he means is the following, that there was no tumah that would be Soser's Nazir. So logically, we would say in such a case, he still has just 10 more days to fulfill his Nazirs. But the Torah says that if he cannot do Giluach at the end of his Nazirs, because he doesn't have 30 days worth of Giluach Seir, he'll only have 10 days worth of Giluach Seir. Therefore, Tzarech lahashlim od esrim yom, he's going to have to fulfill another 20 days of Nazirus, kedei sheyuchal l'kayim mitzvahs tiglachas kilchasa. So it's not exactly the way I said it before. Second. So again, he needs another. Wait a second. Again, he counted 20 days, then they cut off his hair against his will, right? And the Tiglachas is not Soser's minion, because he wasn't Tomei. So again, now he should add just 10 days. Then he's Mekayim his Nazirus, right? No. But then he'll only have 10 days worth of Gidul Seir. Is Tzarech lahashlim od esrim yom. This I don't understand. What do you mean od esrim yom? I have here a problem. I'm sorry. There seems to be a contradiction here. Limnos shloshim yom. He needs 30 days after the Gilui. Why does he say here esrim yom? This I can't figure out. There's a, again, it's my mistake probably, but there seems to be a contradiction here between the text itself and the footnote. There's a footnote saying that after he fulfilled his Nazirus of 20 days. So I thought he would need a full 30 days. And that's what he says here on top. But in the footnote, for some reason, he says, Sarch la'ashlamo to esrim yom. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm stumped over here by this footnote. Usually the footnote clarifies, but for me, in this particular case, the footnote confuses me. Okay. Okay, nitma biyom gidul seir. So now we're going to have Machlokes Rav and Shmuel in the case where they cut off his hair before he completes his Nazirus, and now he has to be Mekayim his Nazirus in order to achieve the mitzvah of Tiglachas. So he's counting that extra period of time for Tiglachas, and now he became Tamid. And it's called in the Gemara's language Biyom Gidul Seir. Again, Gidul, even though it used the word Yom in singular, but it means all those days of Gidul Seir. All the days that he's observing his Nazirus in order to grow his hair so that he can Mekayim his mitzvah of Nazirus. Again, in the footnote, I'm afraid to read this now, but he says, Gilchu liachar esrim yom, liachar mikam mona asor yom lashlomas Nazirus, so v'yod esrim yom b'shvil gidul seir. Oh, now I got it. Baruch Hashem. I finally figured it out. So again, he was Mekayim his Nazirus for 20 days. Then they cut off his hair. He needs to count 10 days to be Mashlim his Nazirus because, again, it's not like Tumah, it's not Soser his Nazirus. And now he needs another 20 days of Gidul Sar that's added to the 10 days that he observed his Nazirus after the Giluah. So now, what happened? He became Tameh in that period of time where he's Mashlim his Seir, if you follow what I mean. Rav Omer Eino Soser. He's already completed his Nazirus with that extra 10 days after the Giluah. And Rav says, Afilu Rabbi Yochanan, who said on Daf Yudalad Amud Aleph that if a person takes a break in his Nazirus in order to count a Nazirus of latest Beno, and he became Tommy during the Yemei latest Beno, Soser, he's Soser even his own Nazirus, which means that it's one long Nazirus. Hani Mili, that's only Heicha the Koi ben Nazirus, because he was Nitma in the middle of his Nazirus. And he never completed the Nazirus of his first Nazirus Didei. But Gidul Seir, Mishlam Nazirusu, question mark. But when he's only continuing his Nazirus in order to be Megadol his Seir, then Tum is not so teres. He already completed his Nazirus with that 10 days after the Giluach. And now he's adding another period of time, let's Lamazog in 20 days, in order to count for Gidul Seir, so he has 30 days of Gidul Seir, but that's not a period of Nazirus, and therefore there's no steer of Nazirus. I wonder if the Brisker Rav would say here that according to Rabbi Yochanan, or Rav, I should say, he doesn't have Kedushas Nazir. It's a separate halach of Gidul Seir for the sake of the mitzvah of Tiglachas Nazir. I don't know. Ushmuel Amar Soser. Shmuel is going to go to the other extreme and say that this Tumah will be Soser all the days that he counted for his Nazirus, because the Gidul Seir period of time is also incorporated into Nazirus, and it's considered a Chalos Nazirus. And Afilu Reish Lakish the Omar, even according to Reish Lakish, who said that Nitma Bimei Bino Eina Soser, and he set up 2 Nazirios, Hasam Shtei Nazirus, there's one Nazirus of Shalom, and a separate Nazirus of Leidas Bino. Therefore, when he's Nitma in Nazirus Bino, it's not Soser his own personal Nazirus Didei, but Hacha Chada Nazirusa. These are not two different Nazirios. He needs a Gidul Seir and a Tiglachas for his original Nazirus, and he can only achieve that 20 days down the line. So if during those 20 days he's observing his Nazirus, and it's the original Nazirus, and his mitzvah of Tiglachas is going to be postponed until 20 days down the line, then if he's nitba during that 20-day period, it's soser his Nazirus. Dam here is referring to Zrikas Adam, which is the Ikar Mechaper Korbanos. And they did the Zrikas Adam of his Korban, but they haven't yet implemented his Giluach Seir. And in between the two, he became a Tameh, he contracted Tumah. Says Rav Chizda, even Rav and Shmuel, both who argue about Nitma Vimei Gidul Seir, they agree that Ein Lo Takana, he's not going to be allowed to drink wine, or to be Megalech, or to be Metamel L'Mesim Li'olam, because he has no Gilua. Eino Yochel Galech Achar She'yitar Mituma, so Kemen She'eino Megalech Below Avos Korbanosah. And he already brought his korbanos. He can't bring his korbanos a second time for tiglachas, so he won't have tiglachas. The kevan she'enu yochel lavi korban enu yochel ligalef adayin kol isurei nazir olav, because all the isurei nazir depend upon his tiglach. I mean, the removal of all his will be suspended until after tiglachas nazir. Now, this is all based on a pasuk that says Kodesh is a lashon of Gidul Seir l'shem Nazirus, and it says V'kidesh es rosho b'yomahu. So his Gidul Seir is during his Nazirus is a kiyum of his kedusha. And at the end of his period of Nazirus, he has to bring Shlosha Karbanos, as we said, a Chatos, an Ola, and a Shlomim. Oh, all right. So this is a sugya later on in Memhei. Not sure if we have to know this sugya right now, but anyway, I'll leave the man. According to which Tana did Rav Chizda make his statement? If he went according to Rabbi Lezer on Daf Mem Zayin Amud Aleph, who holds that until he's Mekayim his mitzvah of Tiglachas Nazir at the end of his Nazirus, all Isuri Nazirus are olav. And again, he needs a Havas Karbanos, but he can't do that. So Kevan Ti Omar Tiglachas Makeves is Toch Malosi. How could Rav Chizda say, just 1 second. So again, according to Rabbi Eliezer, it's before his Hashlomas Nazirus because Tiglachas Makeves. He cannot fulfill and complete his Nazirus without Tiglachas. So therefore, it's like he became Tameh after he completed the minyan of his Yimei Nazirus, but he hasn't brought his Karbanos, the lista. So in other words, why does Rav Chizda say Ein Lo Takana? According to Rabbi Eliezer, Tiglachas Makeves, so he never fulfilled and completed his Nazirus because he wasn't Megalech Sa'ara. And they brought his Karbanos before he was Megalech Sa'ara, and therefore he still Toch Milos. The fact that he counted all the days of his Nazirus and he brought the Karban is not enough to terminate his Milos. And therefore, since he completed the minyan of his Nazirus, he hasn't yet brought his karbanos, then the law is that if you become Tomei after the completion of Yemei Nazirus, then Listar, what happens is the Tumah now is Sosa the 7 days until he's Mitayar Mitumas Mes. Then he brings a second round of karbanos, and he does Giluach. So why do you say Ein Lo Tikva? Ein Lo Takana. Ella, leave it to Rabbanon. I don't understand. You're going to tell me that we're going according to Rabbanon, that a Nazir brought his karbanos, he's allowed to drink wine and be mitami himself even before Giluach. That's also difficult. Amri, the Rabbanon say, Tiglachas lo makeves. So after the Zrikas Adam, he's allowed to drink the wine, and he's allowed to be mitami, and he's allowed to cut his hair. And now you're going to tell me that he's going to become Asur in all these Isurim because he became Tomei Lemes? That doesn't make any sense. Is Tiglachas lo makeves. And once the heter was chal with the Zrikas Adam, then now you're going to resurrect the Isur after the heter was chal, just because he was Tomei Lemes? Gemara answers, Liolam, I'll leave it to Rabbanan. And Tiglachas Eina Makeves. Umay, and what does it mean, Ein Lo Takana? Ein Lo Takana lemitzvahs Giluach. He cannot fulfill the mitzvah of Giluach, which means that he's mutar b'yayin u'b'tumah, even without Giluach, and he will not fulfill the mitzvah of Giluach. So here we have a long discussion about why he cannot fulfill his mitzvah of Giluach. So he quotes here Tosfos, Kevon she'eino yochel legalech b'tara, ein lo mitzvahs tiglachas klal, ela mutar miyad b'shtias yayin v'tumah. And now he quotes Rabbeinu Peretz, she'ein lo mashi galech kishi toer, mishum she'nozir tzorach lisrof esaro tachas hadud shel shlomin. Kimvur b'mishnah lekamon memheim and beis yachash nitar eno chozelavi karbanos v'lo yilo dud shel shlomim lisrof saro tachtov. So the din of Rav Chizda is dafka when he brought all his karbanos of Nazirus. If he still hasn't brought all his karbanos and he has an obligation to bring mitzvahs karbanos when he becomes tar, then he could be megalech sorrow, and he'll put it under the dud of shara karbanos. So according to the final maskana of this Gemara, when Rav Chizda says hakol modim, he means afilu sharav u'shmuel nechleku legabe nitma biyom gidol se'ar im soses neziruso kan shenitma bizman shekvar mutal legaleach hainu liachar shevi karbanosov zenechsev kilu gileach kfar veino soser neziruso lekulial. Amar Rabbi Yossi Rab Chanina Nazir shekalu lo yamav. He completed all the days of his Nazirus. He has not yet brought his karbanos, and he became Tamei b'mezid in this case. Loke alatuma. He gets malchus for violating his Isur lav of Tumah, even though kol lo yamav, but he hasn't brought his karbanos. However, if he was megaleach or he drank wine, b'mezid eno lokal hatiglachas v'lo hayayin. So Gemara asks Maishna, what's the difference that with regard to the Isur Tumah Loki, he gets malchus, but with regard to the Isur Giluach and Shtiyas Yain, he doesn't get malchus? Gemara answers the Omakra. The pasuk says in the parasha of Nazir, "Naso kol yemei haziro lashem al nefesh meis lo yavo." And what's the emphasis here? The ribuya of kol lerabos hayomim shaliachar melos kiyomim shalifnei melos. So the ribuya here in this parasha of the Isur Tumah of a Nazir is that after he completes his Yemei Nazirus, has the same status as before his Mashlim Yemei Naziruso. And therefore, just like if he contracted Tumah B'mezid during his Malos, he gets Malchus, so too after the Malos, he gets Malchus. And that's because he has not yet brought his Karbanos. So the Gemara asks, if from the word kol, we're going to be marba that he gets malchus for the tumah, is that tiglachas nami l'chayev? He should be chayev malchus also for tiglachas b'mezid, even after kol yemei naziruso, because he hasn't brought his karbanos yet. The Omar Rachmana, let's see what the pasuk says about tiglachas. It says, Kol Yemei Neder Nizro Tar Lo Yavar Al Rosho. And we again have the word Kol, Lasos, and we should derive from the word Kol, Yomim Shaliachim Alos, Ki Yomim Lifnei Alos. And therefore, if he's Megalech before he brings his Karbanos, he should get Malchus, Vesu. And furthermore, it's difficult, even with regard to the Isur Nazir B'Yayin, it says, Kol Yemei Nizro. So again, we have the word kol. Lasos is yom shaliachim melos ki yom shalifnei melos. So even though he was after the completion and he was mamalez yemei nizro, if he drinks wine before his karbonos, he should get malchus. And here on Daf Tesvav, the Gemara answers Shani Hacha. This case of Isur Tumah is different from the other Isurim of Nazir, the Amar Rachmana. With regard to Tumas Nazir, the Torah says, V'chi yomos meis ola b'fesa, fis'om, v'timei rosh nizro, that the Isur of Tumah is b'mi shenizro tolui lo barosho. In other words, all his Naziris depends upon his head. In other words, he was mashlim his mei Nazirus. All he has left is the Nazirus of Sar Rosho, because he wasn't Megaleach as of yet. Now we'll have to see how this impacts on the Shita of Chachamim, who say that Tiglachas Eina Makeves. But in regard to the other Yisrei Nazir, he doesn't get Malchus, because the Torah doesn't say with regard to them a special pasuk to be marbe. Meisvei, the Gemara asks a following question from a Brisa: Nazir shekol lo yomav osur legaleach v'lishtos yayin uletami lemesim. So even though he was mashlim yemei his nazirus, but he hasn't yet brought his karbanos, he violates the Isur tiglachas yayin tuma v'gilech v'shos v'yayin v'nitu lemesim reizes sofikas arboim. And the Bryce is explicit that for all of these three, he will get Malchus Arboim Tuvta, and this Akasha on Rabbi Yossi. For Rabbi Chanina, we have no solution to this problem. Okay, then, so this is where we'll stop here on the top of Daf Tesvav Amid Aleph, and Amir Hashem will continue that Daf tomorrow.